lastly, just two measurement pieces that I think it's important that we consider, and you will all recognize this. The adoption of a risk-adjusted recidivism plan, and that is an effort to determine if recidivism rates post-enactment of criminal justice reform for low and medium risk offenders are declining, even though recidivism rates for high-risk offenders may increase. And so the real concept here is that, you know, the idea behind 1176 and the juvenile piece is that we're going to end up probably on the adult side, since we are diverting or intending to divert many low-risk non-violent offenders into community-based options like accountability courts and maybe higher levels of probation supervision, that our inmate population is going to ultimately, we expect, be a higher risk, more chronic violent offender. Ultimately, that may mean that as those offenders are released, and I think Greg and Stan can tell me, I think we're releasing about 18,000 inmates a year in Georgia now. And one might expect that in the future, post-enactment of 1176, that the recidivism rate actually goes up. And it goes up because the people that are getting out are higher risk, more chronic violent users than what we've had in the past. And so the concept here is that in order to gauge for that, in order to measure that appropriately so that we don't, we're not confused over whether we've had success or not with 1176, is that we adopt a risk-adjusted recidivism plan that allows us in the adult arena to define recidivism and reconviction and return to prison every 6 months for 6 years following release, and use this new next generation assessment at sentencing to determine risk level at time of placement. And in essence, it is simply a new measurement to determine whether or not we are diverting the low-risk offenders and whether the high-risk offenders are using those hard days. And so any questions about the first component of the new measurement piece? The second piece is a little more difficult, but I can go through it pretty quickly. So the adoption, with recommendation would be the adoption of a risk recidivism plan.
Yes, who's on the phone?
This is Ellen again.
Yes, Ellen from Pew.
So Judge Boggs, and this is something that I'm sure that you're, when you get into the weeds of this specific, the risk-adjusted recidivism stuff for both adult and juvenile, I understand you had a conversation with Adam last night about possibly adding in some more detail to include severity of reoffense, time to failure, those kinds of things?
Yeah, correct. I hadn't gotten to that yet,
okay.
But and in fact, wasn't really even sure, Ellen, if I was going to present that today, other than just the general consensus is that I think the council agrees that there is an issue on recidivism calculations in the future, and how might we best get ahead of that curve so that we are measuring the appropriate things. So, you know, ultimately, I think the goal here is on the adult and juvenile side to kind of adopt this new measurement, and that's the recommendation from the work group to the full council for your consideration.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
And we're going to leave it, I suspect, to John Spear and others at Corrections to determine the methodology of calculating that, to go to Ellen's question, not to ignore it, and that is, to what extent do we use criminal history, to what extent do we use offense level or offense, and to what extent do we use computerized criminal histories to determine whether or not we're diverting the right people, and whether or not the recidivism rate is going up or down based on our new stratifying of offense levels.
JP?
Thank you, Thomas. Your Honor, just so I'm clear, you know, this would take into account the level of offense, low, medium, high, of the individuals that are being released, so we can monitor their recidivism rate respective to the original offense level?
No, this measurement does not take that into consideration. This measurement is simply a measurement of risk levels included in a recidivism calculation. Heretofore, our only measure of recidivism is all 18,000 people that get out. We track for 3 years and determine whether or not they've been returned to prison.
Right.
And we know that number is roughly between 30 and 33%.
Right.
Roughly 6,000 people. The problem that we anticipate is that as we divert lower risk offenders out of the prison system and into community-based, evidence-based programming, the people that are going to be getting out are going to be higher risk offenders.
Right.
And if we don't include a risk level in our calculation of recidivism, we're going to have a higher rate of recidivism, And we want to be able to articulate why. And the why is we've now been able to cull out, if you will, and extrapolate out the risk levels of the current standing population and future populations. And we can tell you, yeah, their recidivism rate is 40%, but here's why. That group is 85% high risk versus the former group pre-1176, which had a large number of low-risk offenders in those released from prison and placed on parole. So this is only a methodology whereby we would include a risk level. It's not been done before. We're taking everybody that gets out every year and determining recidivism rates. And that it's probably been artificially low because of the inordinate number of low-risk offenders that have been heretofore sent to prison, and that under 1176 probably won't. So it's just a way to compare apples to apples so that in the future recidivism rates aren't improperly reflective of a problem with 1176, but more accurately reflect the goal of 1176, that you are going to send out some high-risk offenders. So with respect to that measurement, that's all we're looking for there, not offense level or anything else. Okay. Thank you for the question. Other questions? All right, we'll vote on these together. And so then we go to the second one, which is on, I guess, the back page of your recommendation, and that's a prison population risk tool. In short, my recommendation and the recommendation of the work group to the full council is that in addition to adopting a risk-adjusted recidivism tool, which we just discussed, is that secondly, we, through regulatory changes, this requires no statutory changes, I think, ask corrections to adopt this prison population risk tool to determine if the risk and offense type of the population is changing over time, so that we can measure whether in fact we are diverting the low-risk offenders. And so what we might expect is that as you look at admissions into the prison system post-1176 and look at the current standing population, one might expect that the risk levels of those two classes of group, those two classes of inmates, goes up. If it doesn't go up, then that's going to be an alarm, I think, and a question that we're going to have to answer. So we would expect to do that in both the adult and the juvenile arena, and our recommendation would be that we contract, or under our existing state contract with Applied Research Services, that they expand that to conduct an annual risk assessment of the entire criminal histories, arrest, sentencing, and behind-the-wire risk assessments for the population, so that we can get a better picture of who's in prison, who's using these beds. And I think if we do that through currently existing contracts, it's obviously less expensive, but it also builds on a framework that John Spear already has and his agency already has with corrections. And so those would be the two recommendations. One is to track recidivism in a more meaningful manner, and the other is to track the current prison population and the risk levels.
And Judge, if I'll jump in there, if you don't mind, and just briefly touch on the juvenile side of the tool for the prison population risk tool. We may need to rename that because obviously the juvenile population are not in prison. But as you know, HB 242 required the use of objective decision-making tools, two of which were the PDRA, or the predisposition risk assessment, and then the DAI, which is an assessment done by the judge, the detention assessment instrument. Both of those will be collecting data already as required by 242 to answer these questions. So instead of having to bring in Applied Research Services for the juvenile side, we should be getting that data from the objective decision-making tools, and we'll work with DJJ to collect that data and map those trends.
And this goes also to Ellen's question on the phone just a second ago. And with respect to the methodology that we would expect John Spear to use, there's a lot of discussion about what ought to go into a prison population risk tool that is intended to determine the risk levels of the current standing population. And one is, obviously, you look at the risk assessments. You look at determining whether they're high risk or low risk. Another is you look at the security classification. You can build that into your methodology. Another is to look at the risk level for parole release. Another is to look at an older tool that predicts parole failure and is one that John's group already uses. And one is to look at criminal history. So that ultimately your goal and the picture that is being painted by this formula is a more nuanced approach as to who is using those hard beds. Are they serious chronic violent offenders? And in the past, all we've ever looked at was offense level. And it wasn't really offense level, it was the nature of the offense. And that tells a story, but I don't think that tells the complete story. And I think what we were driving at with the criminal justice reform efforts in the past is, with all of the data we now have about what drives criminal conduct and who are these people that are in prison and how can we best serve them, is this nuanced approach that we have enough data now to really drill down and get a better picture of who's there and ultimately decide if those are the people that ought to be there. And so I would leave it up to, under this recommendations, corrections and parole and SPEAR to determine the methodology for using this, but conceptually using risk and offense type so that we can gauge who's in our standing population is important. So those are the two recommendations about new formulaic processes to gauge prison population and risk levels. If there are no other questions, I'll entertain a motion that we recommend those as well.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, that's my report.